Welcome to Ethics Matter. I'm Stephanie Tsai. My guest today is Charles Sennott, who spent 25 years on the front lines around the world, much of that with the Boston Globe in the Middle East and Europe, and later with the Global Post, a news organization and website that he co-founded. Today, he is focused on training a new generation of, let's call them millennial journalists in the digital age. The Ground Truth Project that he founded has awarded more than 100 fellowships to these early career journalists, and they are producing award-winning work that you can see on their website, thegroundtruthproject.org, as well as on their partner platforms. So Charles, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Such an important inflection point time for journalism. The landscape has changed vastly. You were a foreign correspondent, a bureau chief in Jerusalem and in Europe for the Boston Globe during what many of us journalists would sort of consider a golden age, when there were foreign bureaus, when people were on the ground reporting from all over the world. How much has the industry changed since then?
Well, I think we're really in a dramatic time of transformation of media. I think it's a revolutionary age for media. I really think it's not an overstatement to say not since Gutenberg have we had a moment to change the way we tell stories to the world.
Not since the printing press.
Exactly. I mean, this is that big of a revolutionary change. So I think the old days of great newspapers and big networks that did a good job on foreign coverage and had great revenue to sustain those big news operations, they were a time of blue sky. And you really did, as a young journalist, and when I first came in the 80s and saw like a path forward where you could become a foreign correspondent. You could go tell the stories that matter. For me, that timed both tragically but importantly with 9/11. So I had been covering the Middle East for about 9 or 10 years before 9/11. And after 9/11, really covered Afghanistan and then Iraq for about 8 months out of the year for the 5 years after 9/11. So that time frame was extraordinary. The Boston Globe, where I worked, dedicated a lot of resources to covering the story. The networks dedicated a lot of resources. I don't know that I'd call it a golden age, but I think it was an age of a big commitment of large news organizations to telling the story no matter what.
Was that a factor of American foreign policy at that time? I mean, leading up to 9/11, before that, there was probably, looking at some of the bureaus that had been based in Eastern Europe, after the wall fell,
right,
some of those bureaus started to close. So was the coverage and the bureaus that you saw around the world just a function of the American foreign policy at the time?
I think there's always an ebb and flow with how foreign policy is being carried out in the world and how journalists are going to cover that. So you're absolutely right. The fall of the wall really led a lot of news organizations to contract and to pull back from covering the Cold War. It was over. I think there was a sense of turning the story into America in the 90s in the Clinton administration. There were a lot of important domestic stories. But I think when 9/11 hit, I think the whole country understood that this was an attack on America, and this was an extraordinary and transformative moment for the world when a struggle against terrorism would begin, and it would begin a long war, the longest war America has ever fought. The war in Afghanistan, you know, at 16 years and counting, is our longest war, longer than the Civil War, longer than World War II. Not the same level of casualties, but definitely a level of expenditure, of intensity, of a drain on our country, on our economy, and not to mention the suffering of the people in the places where this war is unfolding, in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Does the Boston Globe, do major newspapers still have bureaus open in Afghanistan? Where is the coverage of the war today?
Yeah, so the war in Afghanistan is still being covered. The New York Times still has a bureau in Kabul. NPR still has a correspondent that goes in and out of Kabul. Some news organizations are still there, but there's been a lot of pullback from covering that war as intensely as we all did in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. The war on terror itself is very diffuse. We're going to see more and more of U.S. military presence in the Horn of Africa. We're going to see a lot of intense focus on Somalia, Yemen. This war on terror is spreading, and I feel like sometimes we feel like it's endless war. And there is that feeling in the air, but I think it's a time, it's a generational struggle against terrorism, and how the media will cover it is quite a challenge, because it's not going to have conventional front lines. We're not going to have the kind of invasion we had with Afghanistan and then with Iraq, where we can go and embed and cover these stories. These are big challenges that are complex, they're nuanced, and I think the reporting is going to have to reflect them. That said, large news organizations are indeed pulling back, and I think we're going to see more and more of that. So the idea of Global Post was, when we first had the idea and we launched in 2009, foreign bureaus were starting to close then in large numbers. The Boston Globe, for example, closed all of its foreign coverage. The same was true with the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Chicago Tribune. Great newspapers across America that had always had international staff were now retrenching, pulling back, and realized they could no longer afford that. That was because of the disruption of the web, had changed their business model and made it very hard for them to fund it. Global Post pushed forward into that space, and we tried to fill a void. And we had 70 correspondents in 50 countries, a confederacy of freelancers. It was a new, very stealth model. But we couldn't sustain it. To come up with the new business models for journalism is really challenging right now. There are very few who've cracked the code on how do you sustain in-depth, quality, international reporting right now in this moment. We're proud of the effort we made at Global Post. But we didn't succeed. We had wonderful editorial success, but we didn't have business success.
And it's expensive to news gather. Not only is it expensive to news gather, but safety issues, which obviously you're very aware of at the Global Post, having lost James Foley, one of your correspondents who was covering the Syrian war at the time when he was kidnapped. Equipping those journalists with the type of training and equipment that they need to be safe on those front lines is very, very expensive.
It is, and so this was the insight at Global Post about 3 years ago that we had to say, okay, what if we actually created a nonprofit that could come out of Global Post, that could actually go at these issues with a mission-driven sense of how do we sustain, support, inspire a new generation of journalists. And we couldn't do that as a business model, so we created the Ground Truth Project. The Ground Truth Project as a nonprofit, which I run now, is separate from Global Post, but it has an idea, which is to say, we need eyes in the world. We need young journalists who are going to be out there. The future of media is unfolding right before our eyes. What we're hoping to do with the Ground Truth Project is to build what we call a culture of safety. Really be sure that we teach these young journalists how to work in the field responsibly, but also how to work on in-depth projects and have the revenue and the resources they're going to need to take those on. Because if they get the standards right and they become good at this, they will figure out the future. So the idea is we fulfill a need for a generation that needs more opportunity, but we also fulfill a need by placing the work with traditional news organizations that need good content from smart young people. And we hope we're going to be part of the future of journalism and really inspiring a new generation.
Let's unpack the model of what you're doing at the Ground Truth Project a little more. So first of all, these journalists are not just American journalists, right? You are, they're basically being granted fellowships, journalists around the world, and they're all young millennial journalists, recent J school grad types?
Yeah, we always say emerging journalists because we leave open the opportunity that someone could be in a mid-career shift and have only been a journalist for a few years, and we would welcome them as well. We've had a few of our reporting fellows who would fit that. So we always say emerging journalists. The idea is 3 to 5 years experience. You've already been through graduate school, or you've gone to a journalism program in undergraduate. You've moved on into your career, and you've hit a point where you're maybe really struggling to do work that matters. You may be at a news organization where you're in a cubicle, and you're part of a process of just the news wheel. and you're not actually getting out of the building and doing the stories that matter. You might be a freelancer with a really big idea and you haven't been able to find a news organization that could sustain it. We then partner with those young journalists through what we call reporting fellowships. They range from, as short as 1 month, sort of an intensive program, up to a year, where we'll fund a project for someone to really dig into a big project, like some of the work we're doing now on climate change is very in-depth, very long-term, and we have partnerships with traditional media, ABC News, PBS Frontline, PRI The World. We work together with them to put this work out and distribute it widely.
As far as the funding for these fellowships, I assume that's through private foundations and donations?
We have been very fortunate to have the support of leading foundations. So we've had the Ford Foundation, which provided our cornerstone grant, and they continue to fund us. We've had support from the MacArthur Foundation, which is critical because it's operating funds, and that allows us to really begin to build our organization. We've also had tremendous support from the Luce Foundation for reporting on religion, and other foundations that have supported our work in different areas.
Does that allow you editorial independence?
Great question. So we only take the funding with a clear understanding that we have complete editorial independence. That's a real, a very important aspect of what we do, and we're adamant about that. We feel the same with our individual donors who've been incredibly generous to us. We've had 2 significant donors who've really allowed us to do a 3-year project on climate change, looking at the human consequences of climate change. So we're in a time of the political landscape in which we have a new administration in the White House with President Trump. And that administration really is changing the game in terms of the relationship between Washington and climate change. There are a lot of skeptics on climate change who are now in positions of power in Washington. And our reporting there, I think, is more important than ever now, because what we're looking at is fact-based human consequences of climate change now.
That's what I like about the reporting I've seen, and you're focusing on the human story, how climate change today is actually having an impact on people in the Philippines, for example, and the knock-on effects of climate change. So it's different. I mean, is that the key to get people to care? Because I feel like in this country there is still this conversation about whether it's even a problem.
Yeah, I know. I actually, it's funny, our team, a really smart team of young editors who came up with the name for the series, which is Living Proof. And in the middle of 2016, the summer of 2016, when it didn't seem like the political landscape would change the way it has, we were wondering, or I was wondering specifically, why are we calling it Living Proof? Everyone understands climate change. We don't have to prove this to anyone, do we? And our young editors were a lot smarter than I was and felt like, no, we really do need to start the conversation with the idea that you have to see climate change. Something about the human condition is that when we're presented with numbers that feel so overwhelming, there's a sense of doom that sets in, and it can be debilitating, and we don't have any ability to act in response to that. Our team of editors and journalists in the field wanted to focus on the human consequences to show people this is real, this is happening. So the stories we've looked at, if you look at human trafficking in the Philippines, what does that have to do with climate change? Well, actually, the typhoon season is 3 times more frequent and 3 times stronger. What that's doing is creating refugees across Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia where climate refugees are in a terrible position in their lives. And the human trafficking rings know that, and they are literally preying on these camps and going into families and buying young women and putting them into human trafficking, and also taking men and putting them into what is tantamount to bondage for labor on fishing ships. This is real, and these are people who are suffering because of the conditions in their lives created by climate change.
Right. So a story like that, you were talking earlier about your partnerships. A big conundrum, it seems, for a lot of journalists is how to distribute great content. You've got this great story you've invested in. You've put people on the fields in the Philippines to report this out. Are you satisfied with the eyeballs you're able to get on the content?
We would say we're happy with our distributive model where we as a small news organization, we can reach millions of readers and viewers through our partnerships with editorial partners who share our values for news. So when we work with PRI The World, our coverage can get out to an audience that's very large, hundreds of NPR stations across the country. When we work with Frontline, our films can get out digitally into the Frontline audience, which is growing every day online, and there's a really great opportunity for us to work with them. That said, we are really trying to grow our audience by building a community around the Ground Truth website as well, so that we can say, if you're looking for the best work being done by young people, you can come to our website, you can see that work curated, and you go to thegroundtruthproject.org and it's there for you, and you can link out to see how it's expressed in traditional media. It's hard for people to sometimes get their head around how this would work, and I think a great example is our project Forever Stand. So Forever Stand is about the road to ending America's longest war in Afghanistan. We call it Forever Stand. That project we're very proud of. It was a year of work all through 2015 and 2016. It produced a series of short films on one girls' school where a filmmaker who works with us immersed herself in this school for 3 years to really tell the story of one girls' school and the community around it. We had another journalist who's lived in Afghanistan for over 5 years, really dedicated herself to understanding the stories, and she told the stories of millennials in Afghanistan. This is a generation that's only known war, yet it's the most well-educated generation in Afghanistan in several generations. And it's the hope, it's the future, it's the opportunity. And we looked at the military handover. 3 very different chapters to the story, and those chapters ran on the PBS NewsHour. So they did a special report, Forever Stand. We ran them on WGBH News, where we're based, the flagship PBS station in Boston. We ran them with PRI The World as radio stories. And we had a feature film that came out of it on the girls' school, which ran on PBS nationally. That kind of distributive model where we're giving a team an opportunity to do in-depth work and then distribute it out is something we're really excited about. It cuts across platforms. I think it's the future of media. I think you can be a small team now and work with larger news organizations, and in that sense really punch above your weight class and really do important work that can reach a wide audience. And it's transformative. You no longer need to own a big newspaper or have a big network in order to do great work and have reach.
The only problem I foresee with that, and the reason I like that model, is because you're not beholden to any corporate interests. You don't have to chase ratings. There's all sorts of good things about the sort of publicly funded journalism model that you're partnering with PBS and NPR. The problem is what happens when the grants run out, right? Is there a self-sustaining aspect to that revenue model that you feel confident in?
Yeah, that's a really big concern for all nonprofits, is how do you sustain? So we were very fortunate to get an investment from a venture philanthropy firm that's based in the Bay Area. They are Draper Richards Kaplan, DRK. They search for nonprofits that they believe have an opportunity to really go to scale. We're really lucky to have them as a partner. And they're really setting out to help us think through that, to think like a startup, to think like a startup that needs to get revenue, that needs to transform journalism and really take advantage of the moment we're in right now. We need fact-based journalism. The media, I would argue, did not succeed in its coverage of this election. We didn't enlighten and inform. And I think the way out of some of the aspects that are broken in traditional media is to really empower a new generation to change the way we do it. DRK, Draper Richards Kaplan, saw that in us, and they've invested in us. So we are right now actively looking at revenue streams that we can bring into our organization.
Without putting cat videos on your website. I mean, this is important, right? Because I have worked at many news organizations. I have worked at legacy organizations. I have worked at websites. And it is very difficult to get around the cat video. When you're building a website like that, you depend on ad revenue, and the ad revenue comes from being able to show this traffic. And you don't have millions of people clicking on the climate change video that you made in the Philippines.
Right. I think you're right. I think the challenges are enormous, but the opportunities are great as well. Like right now, we live in a moment where we are going to transform media. And I think the future is bright. I think we live in one of the most exciting moments right now for a new generation to redefine journalism. Not to question its core values, which in my mind will always be about being there on the ground, hearing the story firsthand, being right there on the edge of history, telling the story through the eyes of the people who are living it, making sure you're giving voice to the voiceless. Those are the core goals of great journalism, and they're never going to change. But the way we tell those stories, the way we can push the stories out through social media campaigns, through impact campaigns, are extraordinary. We live in a time where we need great journalism in the world. And we live in a time when journalism has never been more under attack. It's under attack physically, as we tragically saw with our friend and colleague Jim Foley. It's under attack editorially, as you see across the world, in Russia, where journalists are thrown in jail if they criticize the Putin administration. It's in Egypt, where the new military junta that has restored itself is locking up journalists left and right. It's across the world.
It may be here as well.
Well, journalists here are going to face some real challenges. And they're going to face challenges from viewers and readers who feel they failed. And there's a lot of pushback that I think is a time for reflection of media in this country that wants to do a good job. It is a really good time to stop and reflect, but not stop great journalism. It's a time to push forward, really listen to the lessons we need to learn, and go do great work. We talk about a sort of feeling in the country that we've never been at a more divisive point. That have we ever seen our country so pulled apart? And I'm a student of history, and I think we have had times when we've been this pulled apart. And one of them was 1968, and you had Bobby Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King's assassination. Nixon was elected in a landslide. The war in Vietnam was raging.
Domestic terrorism, you can go on and on.
Rioting was happening in cities across the country. And what I think is worth reflecting on is, how did we pull out of that? And what role did journalism play in pulling the country up and out of a war that history proved was ill-fated and wrong?
But
that was great reporting in My Lai that did that, if you remember, with Cy Hirsch, investigative reporting. We also went after an administration that said the press are the enemy. And actually, Woodward and Bernstein went very hard into that presidency and ended up doing great investigative reporting that changed history and ended up with President Nixon resigning. I think it's a moment for us to focus on great journalism, not be deterred by some of the failings of the past, and not be deterred by a tenor in Washington that's going to attack the media. It's time to be strong. It's time to do good work.
But would the Cy Hirsch article on My Lai, would that have been widely distributed and read in order to make change in today's world, where you have such a diffuse amount of journalism on social media? David Fahrenthold did terrific reporting at the Washington Post during the election, and people that attack the media en masse maybe didn't read his reporting, which was trying to hold both the candidates to account, but his beat was Trump, and so he looked very deeply into his business connections, into the potential conflicts of interest there. Those stories were reported, and yet they didn't seem to be picked up en masse.
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, I think one thing we have to do is stop and unpack the word media. Media is it's being kicked around these days, and it's too big a word. Because you have people in a basement in Macedonia fabricating fake news stories that we all know about, that were just pure, unadulterated lies put out through social media. So is that media? I would call that just criminality. That's something that exists in the dark corners of the web right now.
Right.
Then you have, in the middle, you have websites that may not have the same standards as traditional media, that may have a little bit more fast and loose with the rules. And then you have the cable networks that have seen a business opportunity in going to polemics. Now that's MSNBC on the left, and that's Fox News on the right. Then you have networks in the middle, like CNN, that have done a lot of good work through the years, but are struggling right now financially. And in Donald Trump, they saw ratings, and they went for it, and they've had record revenue. You have newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post that have staffs of some of the best journalists in the world who work every day very hard to get it right. And you have others like Breitbart that are looking at sort of stories that I think are very disturbing in the way they are a dog whistle for racism, for sexism, for a lot of the really darker aspects of what has come across the media landscape. So the landscape itself is varied, it's complex, and we can't really talk about one media.
Sure.
But when you talk about, could Cy Hirsch today tell that story of the My Lai massacre, and would it resonate the same way? It's an excellent question, and I think we do need to worry about what happens when we live in a world where facts are devalued, where truth is seen as malleable, where we can't even agree on the same set of facts anymore as a country. How do we have an enlightened debate? I think that's the challenge of the future of media, is how are we going to come across in a way that we're trusted and we create a new future for this. The way I think we're going to do that is it's not going to be me. I am not a digital native. I'm part of a traditional media background, but I get it now that young journalists will figure this out. They will find a way forward, and we're going to empower them not only as journalists with good standards, but with an entrepreneurial spirit. Right now is a time for entrepreneurs to create new models of journalism. I'm going to hope they hold on to the great values of traditional journalism, but push forward into new ways to tell it. We need them, and we really need this generation to be empowered.
Great point to end this on. Charles Sennott, thank you so much for speaking to Ethics Matter.
Thanks for having me.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.